Will, and thank you to the Hunter Research Foundation for the opportunity to join you today. And of course, to everyone who's dialed in, I'm sure you've got lots of things to do with your time. So I really appreciate you joining us. And I'd like to also extend the acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to them and their cultures, and to elders both past and present, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. When 2020 started, I don't think any of us thought we'd be in this position today where we're doing webinars instead of meeting in person. Of course, COVID has, in a sense, it feels like it's changed everything. And some things it's changed a lot, and I think other things will probably continue. But I really want to focus on some of the things that have really changed. We are in the midst of the largest global downturn since the Great Depression. I think we've probably passed the very, very worst of the downturn, and things are getting a little bit better slowly. But there's no escaping the challenges that COVID's thrown up economically. Countries obviously have reacted quite differently, been affected quite differently. Some of those reactions reflect differing approaches to dealing with the virus itself, and sometimes the response also has just been a reflection of the economic structure of a particular country. The more manufacturing you have and the less kind of services or people-to-people contact, particularly trade and service across borders, you know, the better off you are, the less impacted you've been relative to other economies. What's clear as we look across the world, though, is unemployment has risen everywhere. Regardless of economic structure or how you've managed the virus, unemployment has gone up. That's obviously a really, really tragic issue for people that are directly involved and households that are directly involved. Measured unemployment hasn't gone up as much as we would have thought, given what's tended to happen is with economic activity constricted, for large numbers of people who've lost their jobs, they're just not seeming to look for new ones at this point in time. I think we can understand there's some linkage between those things. So in Australia, the unemployment rate has gone from about 5% to about 7.5%. But if you look at measures of unemployment that include people who are either working fewer hours than they would like, or have, including people who've also, in a sense, exited the labour force, in Australia, it would probably be in the mid-teens. In the US, it would be 18%, and we think in China it would be 16%. So the income shock for people obviously has been quite dramatic. As well as that, countries that have got back to work have tended to kind of push production back to work, and services have tended to lag. So I think that there's a bit of a disconnect there that will have to kind of work itself out. It seems increasingly clear that if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it really needs to be a vaccine or a treatment. The uncomfortable reality is we've never developed a vaccine against a coronavirus. I mean, this is a novel coronavirus, so it's new. But in terms of that class of virus, we've never developed a vaccine. But then there hasn't really been the sort of overwhelming requirement for a vaccine we're seeing today. I mean, if you were to pick the single biggest global problem today, it's finding a vaccine for COVID. Humans are pretty ingenious. You know, there's a good chance that we'll get there, and there are somewhere between 150 and 200 vaccines in development today. Vaccines go through 3 stages. There's 3 vaccines that are in the 3rd stage before you really start to consider rolling them out. So look, we're getting there, and I have my fingers crossed that 2021 will be the year of the COVID vaccine. Even with all that going on in the background, financial markets actually have been unusually stable. The equity market was weak through March, but then has recovered quite well. Credit and funding markets have been quite stable. Even the Aussie dollar, which normally is very sensitive to the global risk environment, it was weak in March and then has recovered back to where it was really when COVID was only an issue for China. I mean, Aussie dollar, I think, probably is in a 65 to 75 range. We're at 71 or 72 at the moment, so pushing up towards the top end of that. The primary reason markets have been so stable is because of the policy response. We're in the midst of the biggest downturn since the Great Depression, but the policy response is the largest we've ever seen. There is no precedent in terms of the number of countries easing and the tools they're using. The fiscal response, the IMF says, is about 3 times the size what we saw in the financial crisis. And the primary reason for the size of the response is policymakers think this is a temporary crisis. That when we deal with COVID, we'll come out of it and the world can kind of go back roughly to where it was before. So they're really going hard on policy. Even once we come out of COVID, crises always change things. Some trends, they change, and other trends that were already in place, crises can really strengthen them. And there's 4 trends that I think are quite important that are interlinked. Geopolitics, technology, inequality, and climate. And I want to talk a little bit about each of those. We're clearly in a more fractious global environment. I use the term G0. That doesn't mean zero growth. It means organizations like the G20 or the G7 are not functioning the way we're used to historically. Part of that is China getting larger. Part of it also is changes within countries and with electorates and voters becoming more polarized and hardening in their views. And partly also there's a reflection there about inequality itself and also technology. We can argue about the data and whether it's wealth inequality we're talking about, or income inequality, or housing affordability, or access to healthcare for young families. But the point is that there's an emerging, often generational divide across countries, which I think has the allocation of economic gains at its foundation, really. And as rates of economic growth have slowed in the last 10 or 15 years, and they have slowed everywhere, I think those kind of existing inequalities have really floated to the surface as primary issues of concern. And interlinked here is technology and the way it's connecting people, not just within countries, but across countries as well. If you think, for instance, about the recent Black Lives Matter protests, George Floyd died on the 25th of May. In the first half of June, we saw protests across more than 60 countries. In the US, polls suggest somewhere between 15 and 26 million people have participated, making it the largest movement in US history. It's really inconceivable to think you could have that sequence of events in a world that wasn't much more connected than it ever has been before. And technology is a winner through this crisis. When we look at industry sectors that have kind of done better or done worse, technology clearly is at the winning end of the spectrum. As consumers, we're tending to use more technology as we spend more time at home, and businesses that want to deliver to people, deliver products to people, both digitally and in physical form, have clearly needed to upgrade their tech. And if you look at the big US tech companies now, they've clearly done very, very well through this crisis, and they're much, much larger. And by tech, I'm not really talking about robots, although that's part of it. Really what we're talking about is digital. I mean, Apple sells the iPhone, but it does a lot more than that. There's Amazon, there's Google, there's Facebook, there's Netflix. These are digital companies within the technology sphere. They're not producing hardware. It's really about software and data. And there's an important linkage between COVID and climate change, I think. I mean, scientists have been warning for quite some time about the risks of a global pandemic, and they've even been quite specific about warning about a virus that was originating in animals emerging somewhere on the planet where economic development drives people and wildlife together. It does sound a bit familiar, actually. And COVID, if nothing else, highlights what can happen when the natural environment does something which is a radical departure from history and a radical departure from our lived experience. Our systems and structures and processes just cannot cope. It just tends to fracture the way our systems operate. So to the extent countries try and work to mitigate the effects of climate change, that obviously directly affects a range of sectors: energy, food, transport, probably 3 of the biggest affected sectors. But climate change also has profound implications for global manufacturing, particularly where energy intensity is high. If you think about what's happened through this kind of hyper phase of globalization in the last 30 or 40 years, as it relates to manufacturing, effectively what's happened is manufacturing has ended up being located in the countries and the locations which which are most efficient and most competitive. And then the energy required for that manufacturing has effectively been transported to those locations through the seaborne trade in coal and LNG, particularly for Australia. In a world where we're increasingly looking at more renewable and sustainable forms of energy, hard to move the sun, hard to move the wind, hard to move hydro. So this manufacturing location issue really gets turned on its head, and the manufacturing needs to be more co-located with the energy, which obviously is a huge advantage for Australia. As a share of population, Australia probably has the largest stores of renewable energy in the world. So particularly for regions like the Hunter that have this history with manufacturing and this DNA with manufacturing, some of which is in the past, I think a world where we're increasingly focused on the climate and renewable energy, actually, there's potentially some quite significant advantages offered by not just Australia, but also the Hunter in this sort of world. Look, to wrap up, COVID obviously is a massive issue. It is the issue for 2020 and probably into 2021 as well, but it won't last forever. And I think as we come out of it, we'll see some trends have really been changed. Some of those trends will be really challenging, but I think some of them are going to throw up some substantial opportunities as well. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Richard. So we're waiting now for those of you, and Richard, you're welcome to stay on screen. We're waiting now for some of you to put questions up on the Q&A forum. And as we wait for that, I will ask you a question, Richard. And if you don't like the question, you can change it into something you do like.
Okay.
In the best political mode. Some would argue that the economic shutdowns due to this pandemic may be repeated in the future as different types of pandemics surface. What are lessons from this pandemic that would tell us what to expect in the economy in the future?
That's a great question. That's probably a little more forward-looking than I've been thinking. Look, I don't know the chances of future pandemics. We compare this one to the Spanish flu, which was 100 years ago. I hope they're 1 in 100-year events. But if they're not, I think we're still learning all the time. But one of the lessons that emerged quite early was how important comorbidities have been to the severity of the symptoms you get when you get COVID, and also what the ultimate health effects are. We're seeing that obviously that relates to diet and lifestyle, whether you live in areas with higher air pollution. I think if there's something I'd like to see out of this, it's a reflection on the way we choose to live at present, and the extent to which we're making ourselves vulnerable to some of these things.
Here's a question. What differences will COVID-19 make to the Australian banking and finance systems?
That's a good question. Look, I think two of the advantages Australia had coming into this was very, very strong fiscal position and very stable and sound banking and financial sector. Both of those obviously have stood Australia in reasonably good stead. The reality is, coming out of this, given we're likely to have elevated unemployment for quite some time, lower household income for quite some time, there'll probably be some structural change through the business sector. The reality is, not every loan that banks have made in the last few years will be repaid. And that will impact the banks from a capital perspective and the financial system, and that will need to be rebuilt. So think of it a bit like the fiscal stimulus during the GFC, a very sharp deterioration in the budget balance, but then it can often take quite a number of years to fully restore the health of that. So I think, let's hope we don't have another big economic shock in the near future.
Okay. A question related to that is, there are arguments that now is a rainy day and a time for governments to spend big. And one rationale is that we're lucky that the interest rates are low. So servicing the debt will not be particularly onerous. What impacts to the economy do you see from paying down the principal over the coming 40 years? Or will the economy just grow out of it?
Look, I wish the economy would just grow out of it. I don't think so. Australia came into this crisis where the underlying rate of economic growth was already decelerating. I think there's a range of reasons for that, not least the fact that household debt to income is at about 200%. The household sector is just getting towards the end of that story. It's just difficult for household borrowing to help house prices, which makes people feel wealthier, and that circularity persists. So I don't think growth is going to bail us out. And unfortunately, also, if you compare Australia today with coming out of the financial crisis, out of the financial crisis, as fiscal repair started, and remember it took about 10 years, the Reserve Bank had 500 points of interest rates they could use to buffer any downside shocks that emerged over that following decade. Well, we know interest rates are effectively at zero now, so that buffer's not there. So look, I hope it doesn't take 40 years, but it might. Look, I agree. Policy should be used during this period. It's an enormous shock to people's incomes. We looked at China in the financial crisis and said the policy response there was unsustainable. It turned out it looks quite sustainable. I don't think we should set very strong limits on policy when they're not obviously being tested at the moment.
Okay. Here's another question about how things will unfold in the future. It's been said by some that this stress on the economy is accelerating pre-existing trends. And you've noted that, for example, the technology sector is going well. Do you expect that to continue in the technology sector? And what are some other trends that you see being accelerated?
Look, I think if I talk about technology from an organizational perspective, technology used to, in any big company, technology used to sit in corporate services. It was a thing that when you came in to do your job, you just needed it to work, right? Technology now sits at the executive committee because it's part of the DNA of the company. It's not just a reflection of what the company chooses to do, but it also determines what's possible, and it's this key input into strategic planning. These things, technologies intermesh now. So we talk about tech as an industry sector, but to the extent every industry is spending on tech now, it's actually a macroeconomic influence. It's a really big deal. In a sense, it's that shift towards much more intangible investment. When we talk about investment historically, I like to say we're talking about steel and cement. When we talk about investment now, we're talking about as much about systems and processes and ways of working as we look at kind of service-dominated economies where tech is a much bigger influence. So I think tech is a big trend, and I think it's probably only going to get bigger, and it's having big impacts on the way we think about economics. Geopolitics I spoke about, that's an unfortunate trend which I think is changing. Reflecting that, we probably have passed the peak in globalization. If there was a year, it was probably 2007, just before the financial crisis. I think that started the beginning of quite a significant structural change. I think inequality, as underlying rates of growth come down, inequality starts to become a bigger policy issue. So more countries, I would expect, are talking about things like universal basic income, are talking about things like, what do our tax systems tax and what don't they tax? And are those decisions fair and reasonable in a world which grows much less quickly? And I think there'll probably be a focus on, and you've seen it in discussions, modern monetary theory. I don't know why it's called modern monetary theory when they tell us that it's the way the financial system actually works, but MMT and ideas around what are the limits on policy and how should we think about the policy framework, I think is a really important trend. It's clear that the central bank doesn't operate independently of the other arms of policy anymore to target an inflation rate and achieve that inflation outcome. Most countries' central banks aren't achieving their inflation outcome, and most countries' central bank decisions are now more intermeshed with fiscal and other decisions. So we've shifted out of that old regime into kind of a little bit of a twilight zone. I think what our policy regime is will increasingly be a point of discussion going forwards, and change as well.
So, in talking about those sorts of trends, the question here is, how can we level the generational divide, and do we need to?
Two really important questions. I'd love to say I have the answers. I also like to think getting the right questions in the policy debate is the first step in getting to the right answers. So look, I absolutely think we're going to be talking about those issues much, much more. it does seem like there's a generational divide. If I look, for instance, in Singapore, the PAP was returned in an election the other weekend, as they have been returned every year since independence, but the opposition now holds a record number of seats in parliament. In Malaysia, in 2018, we saw a change in government for the first time in 61 years, I think, or something like that. If you look at the surveys of the last election in Australia, voters aged 18 to 35 now support the Greens more than they support any of the major parties, and yet for voters 55 and over, support for the coalition is 3 times the level of support for the Greens. So I think there is a kind of an intergenerational issue here. We can argue, if you want, that these intergenerational concerns are not valid. The reality is young people are telling us something very, very clearly. I think we should be listening.
Earlier, you brought up the topic of climate change being a major factor, and one of the questions here is about the bushfire season of the last year. Will the fires earlier in the year impact our economy in the longer term? And combining this with COVID, how do we stand against another natural disaster? So how do you plan globalization, pandemic, and climate change together in 3 minutes?
Well, if you really want to do all that, become a politician, because they get to handle all of that. Look, it seemed like we learned a lot out of the bushfires when it came to COVID, actually. It seemed like there was much more decisive action when COVID hit. So we can be thankful, in a sense, for the bushfires, just like in a sense we can be thankful for the financial crisis when it came to the economic policy response this time, because it looked like there was a bit of financial crisis DNA in how people responded. Look, I hope the bushfires really light a fuse to people. And again, a bit like COVID, this stuff can actually happen. Smoke from Australian fires can actually lap the world. These are really important issues. I think kind of hoping they're not okay or ignoring them because they're not consistent with our lived experience. I think we really need to ask, what does your life look like if the climate and the environment does something which is so different from history?
Did you really mean to use the phrase, you hope the fires light a fuse?
No pun intended.
Pun intended. Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Okay, well, put this one to you. With what's happening, is it a backward step looking internally for market stimulation, or should we continue down the path of global market access, given the cautions you said about we've reached the peak in globalization? My belief is that we should think big and become world leaders in a variety of markets. Is this the vision that we should have?
Look, I think so. Look, I think as we look backwards over the last few decades, it's clear many countries didn't share the benefits of globalization particularly well within their own economies. But globalization and being outward does bring enormous benefits, both in terms of ideas and just standards of living. So I think Australia should stay outward, but I suspect most people would agree some diversification in our export basket would be useful. Australia's export basket, fortuitously, has been quite reliant on some commodity baskets this time. I think as I discussed, I think in a world particularly which is more focused on renewable energy, there's a chance to really rebuild that manufacturing piece. And I think in the sort of geopolitical world we're thinking of, I think governments will be a bit more focused on areas that they want to have a bit of self-sufficiency and manufacturing capacity in.
Okay, so shifting the balance in self-sufficiency versus global market.
Look, I think so. And there's clearly kind of trying to be global is more complicated. There's more nuance involved. There's more diplomacy involved. It's certainly not as straightforward as it has been in the past. Okay,
great. Well, thank you for your answers. I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A portion. When Anthea is speaking, you might listen to Anthea and out of the corner of your eye, look at the other questions. There are another 25 questions there. And what we may do is after Anthea's spoken, have a bit of time to address some of those as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you for your responses.